So the city has set a goal of issuing building permits for housing goal for 3,000 new units by July 2021. That's a pretty aggressive goal. How do we get there?
Yeah, thankfully, my fellow councilors agreed when I brought forward the desire to really push on housing and the lack of supply that we have. And so we really, having the goal of 3,000 units permitted by July 2021 is pretty aggressive. One of the ways we get there, first is we need to fully implement the urban growth boundary plan. And so we have land that's entitled and then also is serviced by infrastructure. Because really one of the things that really hangs up development is the lack of infrastructure and the cost to install that infrastructure. And so one of the things that we're doing is fully implementing the urban growth boundary plan and then also looking at code opportunities to make the code more efficient, to have a wider variety of housing types. And so that way we can kind of meet people where they're at with their needs for the housing types, because there's a lot of missing middle type housing that we don't have in the city. And that'll, shared courts is a good example, or the revisions in the cottage code are some of the things that we're working on to make the development code easier to build some of these products.
So the federal government recently awarded a $60.4 million infra grant to ODOT for the Bend North Corridor project. You were instrumental in that effort. Tell us about the project and how it will impact transportation in Bend.
The North Corridor project, which is the north part of Highway 97 around Roble and Cooley Road, is really instrumental into relieving congestion. We recently were awarded a grant from the federal government of $60.4 million. It's a larger project than that. We also have $50 million from the state through House Bill 2017. And it's probably, if not the biggest, probably one of the biggest infrastructure projects to ever be done in Bend. And it's going to be really transformative for the north end of town, not only for just dealing with the traffic congestion that you have, especially anybody traveling the North Corridor on a Friday afternoon or any afternoon between Bend and Redmond knows once you hit Cooley Road, you're going to sit there for a number of lights. And it's not an overly safe section of roadway, so that'll really address that. It'll actually be a realignment of the highway to the east, closer to the railroad tracks. And then the current highway actually becomes an extension of 3rd Street, so you can still access all the business district that's in the area. The other piece that it will be really helpful is that it'll actually unlock some developable land. Because right now with the congestion at Cooley Road, there really isn't a lot of trips that are allowed through that intersection. The city has an agreement with ODOT for Juniper Ridge, and that limits our number of trips we can put into that. And so by improving this section of roadway, we can really unlock development in Juniper Ridge, and then also in the North Triangle area in between Highway 20 and Highway 97, there's a urban growth boundary expansion area in that part of town. And so that actually allows that development. It's one of the key components that it's actually hanging that development up right now.
All right, so back in December, the Bend City Council passed an ordinance expanding the number of duplexes and triplexes that can be built in the city's standard residential or RS zones. Can you tell us about that policy? What was kind of the council's goal in developing the policy and the overall intent?
Last year, the council decided to reduce the lot sizes that were required for duplexes and triplexes in the RS zone, or the residential standard density zone, which is typically where you see single family detached. And so what we wanted to do is actually allow for greater density and more mix. When you look at some of the neighborhoods in the city of Bend that were created prior to zoning regulations, they're some of the most desirable neighborhoods in the city, but yet they have a really mix of housing. There's a lot of housing that's multifamily in some of the older neighborhoods that you would never know that are there, because it was done nicely and tastefully and kind of fits the character of the neighborhood. So we were hoping that with reducing the lot sizes on a duplex and a triplex from down to 6,000 and 9,000 square feet per lot, that would actually give a little more variety and a mix of housing, and actually help our lack of housing supply in the city to be able to bring more supply on board and give those opportunities for people to build a duplex, maybe live in one side or have it as an investment property.
So kind of a follow-up to that last question, House Bill 2001 has been getting a lot of attention recently, passed by the legislature. What do you see as the impact of House Bill 2001 on Bend, and how will it be implemented in the city?
The impact of House Bill 2001 on the city of Bend, I don't know that it'll have a lot of impact on the city, because honestly, the legislature and the state, while they were developing that legislation, looked to a lot of things that Bend was already doing. We're already allowing duplexes and triplexes in the RS zone. We do a lot of those things. We have ADUs, we have cottage code development. There's a lot of things that we were already doing, and so I'm not going to say that it's entirely modeled off of Bend's code, but we definitely had a lot of impact on that legislation, to the point where we were even having staff work with the legislature in drafting that and what had worked well and what hadn't worked well. So we had a lot of impact, so I don't see a huge impact on the city of Bend. There are going to be some code changes that we will have to make as a result of that legislation. For example, we'll have to remove parking requirements. House Bill 2001 removed parking requirements for accessory dwelling units. We required parking requirements in our code for those, but I think that's a reasonable change. It's a fairly minor change in the code. Probably the biggest difference or biggest impact that will be on the city of Bend is really adding fourplexes into the RS zone. That is a requirement of House Bill 2001, but we were already looking at that and evaluating that and figuring out how to do that properly. And really the thing that was hanging us up biggest was the density requirements and the density calculations in the RS zone. And now that the state's removed that, that's really not a consideration or a concern that we have anymore. And so it's actually going to be easier for us to implement that, something that we were already looking at already.
So from your perspective, what do you think the greatest challenge is that the city's facing right now?
The greatest challenge the city is facing, particularly in regards to housing, is affordability. Affordable housing is at the top of mind for everybody, whether you're an employer trying to find employees that can live in the city, somebody trying to find an affordable rental, whatever that is. Affordability is probably the biggest issue that we deal with. The challenges of that and the way to fix that are multi-pronged, and there's a lot of things that have to do with transportation. Can you build a development based on the deficits in the transportation system? Might stop a development from happening, and we have a supply issue in housing. And so we're underbuilt right now, and we need to build more housing. So that, those things are things that we have to look at, and what's hanging that up? Is it is it the code issues, or is it transportation or other infrastructure that's hanging up a project either from not happening, or those infrastructure pieces are too expensive for one development to incur on itself? And how do we make that work? And transportation is clearly the biggest deficit we have. Our water and sewer are much better, but the transportation system has a lot of deficits, and that I think anybody can see that driving around Bend on any given day.
I know that we've only touched on a couple of topics, and we could obviously talk about a lot more things, but in closing, are there any key issues that you think realtors need to be aware of in the city and watching?
A few of the key issues that the membership of COAR needs to pay attention to, things that are on the horizon that I'm seeing, is possible further regulation of short-term rentals. The city went through a really in-depth process to develop the current set of regulations in 2015, and those were adopted in fall of 2015. But there's some discussion about further regulating where short-term rentals can be and what property types they could be used on. So I really think that the membership needs to be engaged on that topic, and letting the city know as those things and those opportunities come up to provide feedback, what they're seeing and how the market is actually behaving right now in regards to short-term rentals. The other thing is the implementation of the septic to sewer plan, or the septic to sewer program. As we start seeing this fall and winter, you'll start seeing some construction on the neighborhood extension program, and then also the city has a CIP project on Desert Woods. So as those are being implemented, just being mindful of your listings and your buyers that are dealing with any properties that have septic systems within the city limits of Bend.